Hello and welcome to Faculty for a Future Communicating the Complex Crisis event. My name is James Dyke. I'm an academic lead at Faculty for a Future and also an associate professor in Earth Systems Science at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. And like many people in the United Kingdom, currently sweltering under a record-breaking heat wave. Yes, climate change is here, it's real, and it's making our lives quite unpleasant. We are going to be talking about climate change, but in a broader context of the complex crisis that humanity has stumbled, perhaps inadvertently, into in this new century, in this new millennia. Sometimes we talk about the social and environmental crisis. The kind of issues that we're talking about are, yes, climate change, the dangerous interference in the climate that humans are producing via the burning of fossil fuels, but also the destruction of the biosphere, the alteration of biogeochemical cycles, the removal of water for agriculture, for drinking, and the implications on social, economic, political systems. We don't expect impacts to be smooth and linear like climate change. It could be very abrupt. Thus far, there is really quite limited understanding, even in an academic context, of what this crisis is. And certainly when you're thinking about communicating the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the potential migration crisis to wider society through mainstream media, there's very, very little understanding of just how entangled and complex and dangerous our current situation is. So I'm assuming that's kind of why you're here today. You might be a practitioner in this field, you might be a climate scientist, you might work on social scientists, or you might just be interested in spending more of your academic practice, more of your academic time, thinking about these issues and how to better engage with wider society, perhaps through journalism, perhaps through activism, whatever that's going to be. So welcome. We're going to propose some items. We have a toolkit amongst which there is some media opportunities, some media training. There are things that we as a project Faculty for a Future want to provide to you, the academic community. And so we're really keen to know, is that going to work? What kind of things do you need? And the beginning of that kind of discussion is, how do you see the crisis? Where do you think we are? And how do you think academia can get more and effectively engaged? It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panelist. It's Matthew Green. Matthew recently joined DSMOG as Global Investigations Editor. Previously, he spent 4 years covering climate and environmental stories at Reuters, with a particular focus on the intersection between the climate crisis, finance, and the energy transition. He is also engaged in the question of how journalism itself will need to transform to perform the service it must in this age of crisis. In 2018, he shared a prize for explanatory journalism from the Society of Environmental Journalists. Welcome, Matthew. Many thanks for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Okay, our next panelist is Sagar Dhara. Sagar is an environmental engineer, academic, and activist who works tirelessly to educate society about the perils of inequality and environmental degradation. He has been an engineering consultant to the United Nations Environment Programme and a professor at the Berlin Institute of Technology and Science. He is a leading member of South Asian People's Action on Climate Crisis, who, along with other people's movements, he supports to win regional justice over polluting industries and governments. He describes himself as male, upper class and caste, university educated, city slicker, member of the most ferocious predatory species that stalk the earth, humans. Welcome, Sagar. Nice to see you there.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, and our final panelist today is Lydia Messling. Lydia is the Climate Change Communications Technical Lead at WTW's Climate and Resilience Hub. She's also a research associate at Climate Outreach. Her research background is an environmental scientist and social scientist. She was a Leverhulme doctoral scholar in climate justice at the University of Reading, which sparked her interest in expert communications and led to her PhD thesis on how climate scientists can engage in policy advocacy and preserve their scientific credibility and independence. She is a senior advisor to Faculty for a Future. So welcome, Lydia.
Morning, thank you for having me.
Okay, right, so let's get going. Okay, so we've got this notion that we are living in a time of crisis, and that there might be I don't think it's controversial at all to postulate there's insufficient action on this crisis. I mean, if we just look at the climate crisis in isolation, there's an ever increasing gap between the political rhetoric and what we need in order to keep safe. So I'm going to put the first question probably in turn to all of you. So I'm going to pick on you to start with, Matthew, right? I've given my kind of thumbnail sketch of the crisis, but what do you think the crisis is, and how have your experiences, some of the work that you've been doing, reporting around the world, tally with this sort of thumbnail sketch of the crisis?
Yeah, well, I think you've summed it up very well. It's a systemic crisis with almost overwhelming array of self-reinforcing phenomena, which can be completely overwhelming to try to contemplate. But something that you said really struck a chord with me in your introduction, when you said there's this kind of media narrative that incremental technological advances will somehow get us to the other side of this. And I recognize that from my time, particularly working in big media organizations where, there's always going to be a silo for let's write about solutions. And that solution might be a story about a guy who's taken it upon himself to pick up pieces of plastic from a beach in Portugal, which is a lovely story about human agency, but it's not a solution to this kind of hyper crisis that we're in. And I think one of the things that we in the media can do in parallel with what you're doing is to give more airtime to that question of how do the systems change, not just how do we make these little incremental adjustments, but what kind of big radical transformational action needs to happen at a systems level for us to have a kind of realistic response to where we are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, many thanks. So Sagar, what's your take?
Yeah, the way we see it, there are three tipping points, and we are at the cusp of each one of them independently, and any one of them, in fact, can tip society over independently. The three are basically, the first is climate change, which, a lot of people are familiar with. The second, which not so many people are familiar with, is the exhaustion of a lot of non-renewable minerals, which many of which, in fact, go into the making of so-called green technologies, which if they start exhausting, you will not really be able to make those green technologies. I'm not going into examples. We can do that a bit later. There are something like about 18 non-renewable minerals which are going to start exhausting out within the next 40 to 50 years, maybe some of them about 60 years or so. And I'm not just talking about fossil fuels, I'm talking about things like copper and iron ore and very common bauxite and very common minerals of this sort. I will club it under the name peak oil, okay? And the third is a galloping inequality. Except in Europe, inequality in virtually all the major economies, that includes China and India and Northern America, has been galloping over the last 20 odd years or so, and is in fact part of the reason for conflict in the world. Right here next door to us in India, in Sri Lanka, we see the first signs of what something like a peak oil phenomenon can do, what is happening in Sri Lanka because of their foreign exchange shortage. In fact, what has happened is that they're running out of their basic energy products, such as food and fuel. And some of us are directly in touch with ground level organizations and policymakers there to see what can be done about it, not by the government, but by people themselves. So I will sum it up this way, that earlier the conflict, if I were to divide the ecosystem into three parts, the first being the ecosystem or the environment from which we get raw materials, the second where we use energy and raw materials in order to make products and services, and the third where we put the wastes back into the environment. The conflict was really in the middle, where the production of services and goods was, because what was happening was that a few were benefiting and a large majority were not. whether you take slave society or whether you take capitalism, that was what was happening. But in the last 30 years or so, ever since the Club of Rome report was written in the early 70s, we have suddenly begun to realize that at the other two ends, where we get our raw materials from and where we put our wastes to, those have become problem issues also. And that is where the conflict, in fact, has started increasing at a galloping rate. So we have all these three problems, and they're all coming to a head at the same time almost. So we have a lot of issues really to look at and deal with.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Many thanks. Well, many thanks for that quite sobering unpacking of the thumbnail sketch. Lydia, where do you think we are with things?
I think it's a crisis of community, and we're really not having the stories to sort of see ourselves in how what a good solution looks like. How do we pull together? So it's challenging us to define our communities in new ways, to see ourselves related in different ways. And climate change is just a really big, scary thing. So if we look at the climate crisis, getting our head around that just requires us to engage with it in a new way. Scientists, we know the limitations that science communication can have in telling those stories, and really resonating with people, but also identifying action in a way that's hopeful. It's really big and scary. Nobody really wants to engage with anything like that for a long time, unless you really like horror movies, right? But still, like, they have an end to them. We can't see the end with this. So it's really important that we sort of think together as a community how we look after one another in engaging with this issue to find hopeful things. So I think it's not unsurprising, and it's entirely natural that these crises are crises and things that we find really hard to engage with. But if cat videos can go viral, if somebody can sing a song about Binley Mega Chippy and everybody really likes it, then I think there's ways in which we can find new forms of communication. I think we've got all the tools we need. It's just a challenge of community and how we deploy them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Right. So it's interesting that we're rapidly throwing things out of this box at the moment, which is the crisis. Yeah, and it's multidimensional. And Sagar, you mentioned the Club of Rome, and it's 50 years this year since the publication of Limits to Growth, and in many ways, some of the media representations of the set of intersecting challenges that we face is maybe even gone backwards. There was a time, perhaps, certainly around the hullabaloo around Limits to Growth, where we are taking a kind of systems approach, where we can see it's about the flows of things in, and we're filling up the places to put pollution. We're running out of places to extract the required minerals, or maybe the energy sources that we need. And often the framing is very narrow today. It's about, today we've got the headlines because it's about the heat wave and it's about climate change. It's about, maybe some quite specific and dry and boring, policy instruments. So I'm going to come to you first, actually, Lydia. So what, in terms of the kind of the media representation or the media narratives around what we've already begun to explore is a very complex and potentially quite frightening set of challenges. Where do you see the major dysfunctions in that media landscape? What are the biggest kind of issues that you think the media landscape is throwing us for us to better understand exactly where we are right now?
Good question. I think so one kind of more like narrative thing that I see and think is maybe problematic in terms of sustaining long-term engagement with issues, and particularly moving the conversation on from shock and awe of impact and onto changes of solutions, and then one other on just like visuals. The first one is, I think media like to hit you in the face, and this is just my experience, with one main emotion. and fear sells,
Mm-hmm.
breaking records sells, and that's just one part of it. And to have a narrative that then moves you through the different emotional responses of climate in something that's a bit more hopeful. I mean, you always get to the end of the articles where, they then contextualize, what can you do? They link you through to different things.
Mm-hmm.
And they just feel so, they can feel tokenistic, like slap a bit of hope on at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so there needs to be a sort of more complex storytelling to bring in these different types of emotions, but actually recognizing they are the things that grab headlines. So it's also, what stories are we continuing to have? How do we weave climate change and other crises narratives into other stories to help us see that it's broader than just these big scary headline figures? On the visuals, nobody likes a graph apart from me and other scientists. We kind of do. We like to geek out over a graph a bit, but that's why media uses visuals so much, photographs, videos. If you scroll through some of the, just this week for the UK with the heat wave, some of the images that have been used have been people enjoying nice water fountains.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really bringing out the true impact of people in hospital beds, the impact on the homeless community. The images that we use can, as they say, we can paint 1,000 words. The images are really important, so we need to make sure that we're using images that are informed by the social science of how we communicate these crises. Again, stories that people can see themselves in. So I think that's kind of where the media can maybe get a little bit better.
Yeah. I have a colleague here, Saffron O'Neill, and a lot of her work is about. She seems to spend most of her time now shaking her fist at news editors who put yet another photograph of women in bikinis or people eating ice cream when there's lethal heat wave. So, I mean, as the practicing journalist, Matthew, are you gonna leap in here and defend your profession? I mean, where do you see?
No.
Okay.
Well, so much is coming up for me as I'm listening to this. And I'm so conscious that we're on the leading edge of a conversation here. I don't have a kind of pre-cooked manifesto to offer of what we should do. But I'm so grateful that we're even surfacing these issues and kind of sitting together, not knowing as we tumble it all out of the sack. What I do know is that I was feeling really anxious this morning about this heat wave and what it means. And as soon as I sat down in the Zoom room with you all, my whole system relaxed. And I thought, we're not solving the heat wave right now, but there's something real in community. And I want to kind of build or maybe pick up a little on what Lydia said about I'm even struggling to find the vocabulary to express what I'm trying to say. But human beings are amazing. We are an amazing species. We're also incredible predators, and we're destroying our habitat and potentially committing collective suicide. And yet we're also all of the opposite of that. And so much of what we see in the media is coming from this assumption that we're these individual, atomized, stereotyped, separate, discrete units all trying to get what we can and being kind of blasted with advertising. The whole kind of starting point for all of it is wrong. It's not actually who we are. And it's when we start to connect in community, just like many of us discovered through Extinction Rebellion or through other movements which have centered what we can do as a group, that's when we feel a sense of empowerment, a new sense of possibility, when innovation starts to emerge. We can't do it on our own. We're going to be sitting like little balls of squashed up anxiety, like I was this morning, until we start to make those connections. And if the media could kind of like get that and find a way to tell that story more effectively, that would be a huge service. And there's 99 other items on the agenda that I haven't addressed yet, but and as I say, I don't even know what this quite looks like, but it feels like there's something we could be doing that we're not doing. So please message me after and help me out with this.
Okay, thanks. Well, we have a question from the audience, and I'm just going to read it out. I'm not going to attempt to paraphrase any questions because I always worry that I'm not actually going to get across the key informational content. So this is from Patrick Wilson. So many thanks, Patrick. Patrick said he's interested in the distinction that's me, draw between incremental technological change, characterized as inadequate, sometimes Patrick, yes, and system change. But what does system change actually look like? And can you give historical examples? Seems to me most of the big changes are the result of accumulated micro changes, but please change my mind. So, okay, that's a question to me, but I'm just the host. So Sagar, you're going to answer that one. When we're talking about, we're talking about in the context of limits to growth, it's all system dynamics and systems thinking and systems approaches. What kind of systems change are we alluding to when we say that we need changes of that magnitude or scale, do you think?
Okay, well, that's a very good and interesting question. Something I tackled with a lay audience just 3 days back, when a lot of environmental movies, most of them on wildlife, excellent movies, but there was one on climate change. And so the people who were showing the movies wanted me to come. I did go. Right. So what I said there was basically that essentially we have a situation where growth is seemingly one of the major problems that we have today, economic growth, where we have really gone into overshoot and we've just taken too much out of nature. And nature is now, or we are beginning to discover that actually we have really taken a bit more than what we should have. And that the waste that we've created is beginning to cause us problems at local levels, but it's going to cause us a lot of problems at the global level, namely climate change. And we've seen what's happened to the ozone hole and so on. Okay, we solved that problem. But then how do we go around solving these two major issues? If you look at what has been happening in the COPs ever since Copenhagen, or a bit later, in fact, you've had 3 sets of countries out there warring it out. The, let's say, developed countries in Europe and Northern America basically saying, hey, let's restrict the temperature to 1.5 because, well, you've already, to a large extent, advanced and developed your country and you want to maintain your standard of living. If the temperature went to 3 or 4 degrees, then, already Britain is hitting 40 degrees. And you probably have not seen these kind of temperatures. We see them every summer. So we are used to them and you don't want 40. And I quite understand that, okay? So you want to maintain your standard of living. And so you want to control temperature rise, fine. So essentially the attitude taken by the Western countries is let's use technology to try and solve this problem, okay? Fair enough. All right. And then you have a bunch of countries like India and China and Brazil and South Africa who are aspiring to get to where you are, haven't quite got there, who are saying, okay, fine, you guys have burnt all those fossil fuels and put all that carbon dioxide out. About 83% of the cumulative emissions have been yours. So why can't we also do it and develop? Okay. There's a third set of countries which basically like Maldives or Tuvalu or, XYZ, the smaller ones, who basically are saying, well, either one of you put those emissions out, we're going to suffer anyway. So both of you stop it. And this is the crux of really what is happening in what I would say climate politics, okay? Now, so you can't solve this problem unless more or less everybody gets onto the same page. And as long as we are divided by national boundaries, we're not going to be able to really succeed in doing this. So this is, absolutely connected with our, political situation. So it's not science alone that can solve this problem. It's really a mix of a whole lot of things, things that we have to get into. That, yeah, if we want to get a whole lot of people onto the page, my point today is not to be very purist about these things. I say, listen, your individual effort, whether you do rainwater harvesting or whether you give up your car and cycle around, or whether you shout on the streets like what happened in Glasgow on that very rainy, cold Saturday. That was the first COP I ever attended. Okay. It doesn't matter what you do, because whatever you do as an individual or as an organization or even as a country is not going to solve the problem, because this is such a huge problem that individual effort is extremely important to be counted as part of the solution, but not to be the solution itself. Mm-hmm. The solution has to be systemic. And if you have to stop that growth, then you have to tackle the two drivers which have driven that growth, which is anthropocentrism and private ownership of property. You have to change the private ownership of nature to usufruct rights and not ownership rights. Okay. Having said that, I will get into, I think, the details of this maybe a little later.
Okay. Yeah, I think you've posed sufficient challenges there already. The notion of just even critically engaging with growth-based policy. I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily the solution is particular degrowth scholarship or degrowth approaches or degrowth policy. I remain agnostic, right? I know I have friends and colleagues who do a lot of work in this area, and I think it's really important. I actually think it's absolutely vital. But I think, irrespective of what your position is on that, I think we could all agree that never ever gets discussed in the context of climate change or the framing of climate change. These kind of the notions of what are the systemic drivers, maybe even some of the pathologies, are never. I mean, it just never features, right? So I'm going to go to Matthew and then Lydia on this next question then. Because
can I add just a couple of words?
Yeah. Sure.
I didn't complete what I said. I said that every individual needs to be counted to try to get onto the same page as the whole world, which means that today what I say is it doesn't matter really what you do as long as you go in the broad direction of trying to do something individually or with your community to move towards sustainability and towards equality or some kind of equity. So it could be anything. I'm no longer going to be purist and say that this is the solution, because from what I have seen, leave aside in Europe or in Northern America, even within South Asia or Southeast Asia, which has largely been my beat in the last 10 years, though earlier I was for some time in Northern America and so on, that there is such a variation in the local contexts and local perceptions that you need to be counted today. And therefore, whether you do organic farming or whether you do whatever you do, you need to say, listen, I want to be part of the solution. Now, getting all these strings together is a very complex job, but that will happen through a rainbow coalition of people right across the world. But I just want to add one last thing, that I do feel that all of you, I'm sure, are sensitive to the fact that the problem has largely been created by the developed world, and that the impact, in fact, is largely going to be, in fact, on the developing world, particularly on the Sahel region of Africa and South Asia. And here in South Asia, since we are familiar with what is going to happen in Bangladesh and in Pakistan and Sri Lanka and so on, I do feel that we need to, in fact, merge our identities. I could be an Indian, I could be from Telangana, or whatever it is, but today I also need to be a Brit to understand what your issues are, and you need to become an Indian or a Pakistani or a Bhutanese to really empathize and understand what is happening here. And that is when we will get out of, at least we will start moving forward out of the technocentric kind of solutions that have been largely offered in the COPs or even outside the COPs.
Sure. Yeah, many thanks. Okay, so then Matthew, given these very different and disparate framings, which typically never get featured in the media, I mean, how can we effectively communicate that to journalists, and how can we as academics or practitioners or people working in this area support those support those journalists who want to communicate these issues, who want to communicate them more effectively, let's say? What can we do to support them?
I think go further, be bolder, like you did with your piece in the conversation. I love the way the conversation is circling around this what one might call absencing in the media of the real discussion that we need to be having. And I mean, I could speak a lot more about that previous question about where do incremental changes become systemic changes? Because I think, for example, in the media, we're really behind the curve on how quickly the energy transition, acknowledging that it's only a part of the solution, right? But it's still really important to move off fossil fuels. You know, we still pick up a paper in the UK and people are talking about intermittency and all these problems. All these problems are totally solvable, right? With enough will, we've got the solutions already. So, you know, we're trailing a decade behind in our discourse at that systemic level. But to come back to your question on how can academics support us, just kind of like loosen your shoulders and like just, you know, maybe just have a little drink and just tell us what you really feel in your body deep down when you're talking about these questions, and we'll gobble it up and put it online and in the newspaper. Because despite all that we read and experience around, you know, the fragmenting of reality and kind of post-truth environments, still the academy is still seen in the media as a gold standard source. You know, we still write up a lot of reports. I spent half my job at Reuters was talking to climate scientists and other scientists about the crises that we're facing. So that platform is there. The invitation is take a little risk, you know, join a few dots, maybe even be wrong in public, but, you know, surface these questions, surface degrowth, surface the problems that Sagar was just talking about, and then we can write about them. You know, simple as.
Okay, that's quite a big ask, right? So I'm gonna put this question or pose this comment to you, Lydia, as someone who kind of, you know, working in this interface between academia and media, because I mean, there's been numerous examples just recently, but, you know, the classic example is a climate scientist is asked or maybe even challenged about Paris Agreement and the highest ambition to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the answer will be, it is still physically possible to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, but more political will is required. And obviously in the more political will is that some of all that multiplicity of issues and complexity that Sagar has been kind of pulling out of this box, right? And none of that gets communicated. And the message is basically it's still physically possible. So one of the concerns I've got is that is potentially a disservice that we're doing to society, if that is the message that we're getting. So Lydia, what can academics do to help, if not transform, at least kind of move or nudge the needle on these kind of messagings and stories about the complex crisis?
Read the toolkit we're about to show you, I think is a little pitch there. But yeah, you know, I think I hear what you're saying, Matthew, on sort of trying to get scientists to loosen their shoulders a bit. And some of the things that you say, I know some of my colleagues would run a mile at, absolutely terrified of how it is they'll be portrayed in the media, and terrified of saying things that are not right. So that's why they stick to those lines about what's technically possible, because you're asking the physical scientists that question. If you want to know about political will and know how realistic it is, are we actually on target for those policies? By what extent are we missing them? Who is missing them? Then go ask the social scientists, and go ask the political economists, the people who do all of this work, who look at transition risk, who interrogate the integrity of net zero sort of promises, and ask them. But they're not necessarily quoted in the media as much, or they're not consulted in the same way as natural scientists, because we see this as is a particular type of phenomenon, and we're engaging with it in a particular way. And yet everything that we've just said says, well, actually we need community, we need a plethora of expertise, and yet we're going to the same experts, and maybe the same people who are really good at media, and not necessarily hearing from a whole sort of diverse range of people from across the globe as well. So that's a challenge for media. But it's all very well as saying, media, go find some other experts. But experts, if media keep coming to you and they're asking for you to speak on issues that are outside of your area of expertise, and you haven't drunk enough to loosen your shoulders to speak to Matt, queue up some people that you know who are experts on this area, people who are maybe outside of your area of expertise that you can quote, that you can direct the media to. And again, you know, this is a theme that we've all sort of mentioned. It's this community, bringing the expertise where it is. You don't need to have it all, but just knowing where it is and guiding others to it can be hugely beneficial to the conversation.
Yeah, and you can say what is obviously common sense as well.
Absolutely.
You know, the thing that journalists and you know, I don't have, as I say, I don't have the answers, and my questions are kind of, I'm trying to model what I want scientists to do. I'm just talking extemporaneously, and I may be totally wrong, and yet maybe together we'll come to something useful out of this. But you know, some things are just common sense, and when they're said by a scientist with those credentials, boom, it cuts through in a different way. Simple message. And you know, political will, isn't that a euphemism for challenging, dismantling all the vested interests that are quite happy for us to run their business models for another 10 years at the expense of burning the planet? I mean, you know, that's what political will means, right? It means a fight. It means a confrontation with status quo versus those who realize that the status quo is unsustainable. I mean, you can say things that are scientifically valid or even self-evident, right? And think, and you know, the other thing is, like, it may be that there are academics and scientists who are listening to this who've had bad experiences with journalists. Generally speaking, journalists don't want to screw you over and make you look bad, like most of the time. I think it's true to say that. I'm confident saying that. I have a lot of things to say about how, as journalists, we can do a better job. But generally, with the exception of some parts of the media that are obvious, generally we're acting in good faith. And, you know, we can sit and chat and kind of like, you don't have to speak in a perfect quote first time. You can say, look, let's talk off the record. Let me try to get across what I'm trying to say. And then we can email back and forth and figure out exactly what you're comfortable with. You can take more control over the interaction and make a deal with the journalist so that what comes out at the end of it, you're happy with, and might actually allow you to kind of push your own boundary a little further to a place that you're comfortable with and that you feel you can really stand on confidently. And then everyone's happy. So, and that's maybe a more kind of like media training type discussion that we can have. But there's lots of scope for negotiation that I think can support this whole broader agenda.
I mean, this is all really interesting. And it's very frustrating because I'm always mindful of time. But one of the interesting and embarrassing things that I've discovered since we published that net zero article is that many of the arguments that we made, other people made years ago, right? And I was just absolutely ignorant of them because they were coming from areas that I didn't really engage in. Some of it was science and technology studies, some of it was kind of sociology, and it's all been out there and it's completely ignored. And people have been making essentially these kind of arguments for years. I mean, you know, Sagar mentioned, you know, limits to growth, you know, for decades, half a century. None of this is necessarily new, but it almost seems we continually reinvent the wheel regards to media framing, and that framing keeps it so frustratingly narrow. So I want to just very briefly, if I could, Sagar, just very briefly ask for your perspectives on if we want to get more traction in this kind of ideas of representation in mass media, about communicating the more systemic change, the deeper change, the unpacking the box, you know, telling different stories about the crisis. What, in your experience, has worked in the past, or what kind of advice or guidance would you give to academics who want to engage with journalists, hopefully through our toolkit, which we'll be soon introducing? Can you offer us any words of wisdom, Sagar?
Yes and no, because because the way the media works in Europe or in Northern America is quite different from the way it works in South Asia, or even, if I would say, in most of the other developing countries. You cannot, in a country, even in a country like India, which has a pretty big press and a vibrant media, you cannot take up the issue of climate change directly. It's not understood by the media. It's certainly not understood directly by people. It has to be dealt with in terms of their living experience. So if there is a flood or there are extreme heat waves, where last year temperatures went up to almost 50 degrees in some parts of the subcontinent, you have to then take it up through that. For example, last year we knocked up an entire manual on how to do low-cost heat reduction technologies in slums. And once they implement it in a few places, then we get into why did this thing happen at all? So you just can't do it the way that it's done in the West out there. So I'm looking at two issues. One is, how do you talk to the media itself? And I would not be the best of persons to talk about how to really address the media in Europe or in the US, because my experience there is very, very limited, though I have published in the media in the West. But I would certainly talk about how to approach the media in, say, in countries like India and so on, and how to approach people through the media. So the first thing is that you can't do it in English out here. It has to be done in the local language. And in a big country like India, you have 30 languages and probably 100 dialects. So that itself is a huge task, because all the literature on climate change and peak oil is in English by and large, but the experience really is spoken about in local languages. So we have one set of problems there. The other set of problems is that the culture is extremely, diverse. And so you have to approach it, given the culture of a particular region in a state, leave aside a state as a whole, because within a state itself, which could be as large as Britain or even larger than Britain, there could be 2 or 3 ecological zones, and the people in different ecological zones have distinct cultures. Like within the same state, I could have the Himalayas and I could have the plains, and the people in the plains and the Himalayas are somewhat different in terms of their culture. So there are, large problems and issues. But what we have found basically is to try and use carbon and energy links to link the local level issues which people observe to the larger global level issues which we want them to start beginning to understand. For example, we've had the largest farmer strike recently in India, where probably something like about anything between 1 million to 2 million farmers sat outside Delhi for over a year through harsh winters and harsh summers. And finally, the government actually backtracked and withdrew the 3 acts which the farmers wanted them to withdraw, which the farmers felt were anti-farmer acts. Now, we use that opportunity to talk to a lot of farmers about the need to have farmers compensated for the carbon dioxide that they sequester. Now, this is not an issue which actually is along the lines of CDM, because CDM has not worked and we are quite clear about it. This is just polluter pays principle. But once that was accepted, that a huge amount of money is owed to the farmers because of the carbon dioxide being emitted by cities and industries which cater to cities, which the farmers sequester, and that they, in fact, ought to be paid for it. Once it took us 2 years to convince a whole lot of farmers in different states, in at least 4 or 5 states, that this is an issue they ought to take up. It is then that we were able to start talking about carbon dioxide sequestration. Why is it necessary? How is it linked to climate change? What is climate change? And all these kind of issues. So we have to take a completely sort of a different route out here as compared to what you can do in Europe or in Northern America. So my experience with the media is that the media generally here is, like all media everywhere, but probably even more so here, is interested in the here and now. Like 2 days back, the chief minister of my state said, oh, you know, we had massive rains and flooding for a week in the last 10 days or so. And he said, oh, there is some foreign hand which did cloud seeding and so on. So some of the media guys called me up. I said, did you ask the chief minister as to how these foreign countries, which are located 3,000 kilometers away from you, can even do cloud seeding, 3,000 kilometers away? Did you ask for proof? No, the media didn't think about it. The reporters who called me up didn't think about all these things. So what then happens is that many of us end up actually writing. And when we write, we find that all right to an extent, anything that we write which talks about the impact of climate change is published. But when we start talking about causes of climate change and the solutions, and we start talking about the rich and the poor, who really suffers and so on, some of the media is reluctant to publish. And much of the media, even the progressive media, even media which is as progressive as The Guardian, I'm not talking about The Guardian itself, but in India or these places, media which thinks that it is as progressive as The Guardian, also are reluctant to publish articles on peak oil and resource exhaustion and what that can do, because that implies a sudden death situation. So we have massive problems with reaching out to people. And so what we do most of the time is actually publish small pamphlets, 1 page, 2 page in local languages, and hold meetings in villages. And that's we found is one of the best ways of communicating with people, for which you really require a large number of people who are grounded in villages, in slums, in cities, to be able to do this. So our problems are somewhat different from yours, and probably far more massive than yours in terms of communication with media or communication with people.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to briefly bring you in here, Matthew. So to what extent does that put more of an onus on academics in the global north? Because if we have generated most of the problem, can we use that awareness and kind of to leverage more systemic and more useful action?
That's a big question, James. I'm trying to think about how to, you see, it goes back to what one of our audience asked earlier, which I think was so apposite, this point about where does incremental, almost individual little action apparently turn into something capable of meeting the moment we're in. And almost every conversation is something about building a bridge across what looks like that kind of chasm. It's difficult because I feel like as a journalist, I'm standing on a very shaky platform already because there's so many flaws in my own system. I don't want it to sound like, oh, you academics should be doing X, Y, and Z to, solve the problem. I'm not approaching it like that. I really feel, I really kind of sense this as a kind of shared endeavor that we're all on together. But that said, don't underestimate what a pithy quote can do. I forget who said it, but I'm sure that when the last IPCC report came out, was it one of the authors who said simply, fossil fuels kill people and destroy ecosystems? I mean, fact, right? But pretty strong quote. Stuck in mind, the one quote from the whole deluge of material that has lodged itself in my mind. So you have weapons at your disposal, right? Or shall we say levers? that you can stick into this machine and start like crowbarring it and finding little places to chisel and kind of perform some kind of acupuncture. And the right words are levers. So anyway, I don't know if I'm actually answering a question anymore, but ask me another one or go over to Lydia.
Okay, I might go to Lydia. I don't think you do acupuncture with a crowbar, man. That's gonna be very messy.
You know, when I started out as a young journalist in Paris bureau, I got told off for mixing my metaphors, and that was over 20 years ago, and I still haven't learned. So thank you for correcting me.
They're no, I quite like the idea of acupuncture with a crowbar. I think
maybe what we need right now, right?
Exactly, it gives you the magnitude of change required. Okay, so we have another question from the audience. Actually, we have lots of questions from the audience, and I do apologise for not being able to address them all. And I'm going to pose this question to you, Lydia. This is from Tara. She writes, we know that scientists are highly trusted by society, but in climate science reporting, we see a very narrow representation of science voices, senior, white, male academics, telling us what we need to know. Is there a better way that dominant media can better collaborate with more diverse science experts? And I'm going to append to Tara's question, perhaps a toolkit.
Again, the little plug. So I think, yeah, absolutely. You know, we all need to sort of take responsibility about where it is we're going for the information. And so Matthew mentioned earlier, you know, scientists can sort of state the obvious, you know, quote the other IPCC reports. There's more than just working group one. There are good summaries elsewhere. In terms of getting other academics in the media, yeah, there's definitely more that we can do, and it ties into this point as well. Actually, there are different stories, there are different experiences to share. So academics outside of the Western world, they're doing some fantastic public engagement, that they're experiencing climate change in different ways and they're communicating it differently, and so there's so much more that we can learn from them. And yeah, I think, you know, there is the default, we want to go to somebody who looks authoritative. Who does that look like? It's pretty damning if we think that that just looks like the old white, sometimes balding, no offense James, but male trying to sort of talk about these things. But our expertise, and actually what we're really asking for is academics to speak on the science. Science is where the authority is. That's where the knowledge is. Trained scientists, even early career researchers, know all of that. They've had to, they have that. It's not just the knowledge of the older scientists. In fact, they're having to find their own little niche. They might know areas a bit better. The value of the knowledge that we're asking scientists to speak to is in the science, not necessarily in them, but they have the training and the privilege and the education to understand that and communicate it. Also, it's probably a good idea for media to bring in maybe younger people from other places, just in terms of what it is they're comfortable communicating with and how they engage with different audiences. People engage with people with who it is they sort of recognize and can empathize with. That's not going to be Father Christmas for everybody. You need to find these new people. Where do you go for that? Well, there's different, if you go to any universities, sort of media sort of contacts, they will know who's got expertise in that area at their university. That's a very simple practical one. And folk like Climate Outreach run sort of an ambassadorship scheme, helping train scientists in different forms of non-expert communication. Again, diverse people. So there's lots of places you can go. I think it's an onus partly on media to be looking for the different people to build up your address book, but do that snowballing thing. Ask your usual go-to academics, who else can I go and speak to this? They might not be offended, might actually be relieved that you're not going to take up more of their time.
So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. And again, many thanks to our panelists for joining us today. We are joined first by Peter Friederici. Peter is an award-winning journalist specializing in science and environmental stories. He freelances for numerous periodicals. He's the author of several books, with his latest, Beyond Climate Breakdown, being available early October. Peter teaches science communication at Northern Arizona University, And he's particularly interested in how complex and important topics are communicated through today's media. His writing, teaching, and research focus on exploring connections between people and the environment and on ensuring that the reporting and analysis involved in such stories are accurate, compelling, and relevant. So many thanks for joining us today, Peter. And Peter, you come from the actually quite pleasant climes of higher altitude Arizona, right?
That's right. We're at 2,200 meters or so, and so it's here. It's a pleasant summer day. So my heart goes out to you, especially in the UK, experiencing something different.
Yeah, well, many thanks, and many thanks for joining us. So our next panelist is Diego Arguedas Ortiz. He's a network manager of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network of the Reuters Institute, University of Oxford. A Costa Rican reporter, he has covered climate science since 2013. His work has appeared in BBC Future, MIT Technology Review, Le Monde, Univision, and Anthropocene, among many other outlets. From 2019 to 21, he worked as an advisor on climate change communication for the Minister of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica and the Climate Change Directorate of Costa Rica. Diego, welcome.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here.
And you're avoiding the heat wave because you're in Scotland.
Yeah, I'm getting the best part of it, I guess.
Okay, well, many thanks for joining us. And finally, I'd like to welcome Lydia Messling. Lydia is the Climate Change Communications Technical Lead at WTW's Climate and Resilience Hub. She's also Research Associate at Climate Outreach. Her research background is an environmental scientist and social scientist. Her Leverhulme doctoral scholar in climate justice at the University of Reading sparked her interest in expert communications and led to her PhD thesis on how climate scientists can engage in policy advocacy and preserve their scientific credibility and independence. She is a senior advisor to Faculty for a Future. So welcome, Lydia. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, joining you from the heart of the heat wave in sunny Coventry.
Okay. Well, many thanks, and I hope you can hang in there for the next 90 minutes or so. Okay, so I've begun to unpack, or at least present, what we consider to be the current complex crisis, the set of kind of entangled social, ecological issues that we currently face, and I think it's fair to say that are typically not represented in mainstream media at all. We have the headlines this week, certainly in the United Kingdom and Europe. There are devastating heat waves, there are devastating and lethal wildfires across the continent. But give it a couple of weeks, temperatures will decrease and the news cycle will move on, right? So what I'd be interested to learn, and I'll just come round to you and probably ask you to do all this individually, is what is your take on the crisis? You know, what do your experiences, your professional practice tell you in terms of what the crisis is? And maybe how do we even best frame it? So if I could come to you, Peter.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question and the introduction and the whole event. I think that the public perception of the crisis, the big crisis, really is just beginning to gather steam a little bit. And that the connections between the different elements of crisis that you've already mentioned in your introduction, those connections I think are not very well understood. And so certainly part of the challenge that the media faces now and will continue to do is to communicate those connections and to communicate that for us in the southwestern US, for example, the climate crisis is very closely linked to issues of immigration and border security that tend to get a lot of, political heat. So I think there's a lot of work to be done by the media in better examining those connections.
Okay, many thanks. Certainly, man, I didn't even mention the sort of the political context, and you often hear that one of the great political concerns around the climate crisis is the potential for large-scale movements of people as they are simply displaced. And we can look at the unfolding catastrophe of the European humanitarian crisis as the countless lives lost with people attempting to enter southern Europe across the Mediterranean as some kind of really tragic portent of what could happen if we get things horribly wrong. Can I go to you next, Diego? How do you see the current situation, or how would you frame it or describe it, perhaps even?
I think media-wise, an issue is even beyond connections. We just don't have mentions of for instance, the climate crisis. If you go to Media Matters in the US, who's tracking mentions of climate change in TV, it's only 1% of the news per year does climate change mentions. And I think this is just like, there's a crisis on like, how do we as reporters understand and cover the issue? If you go to the top outlets in the UK now, half of them, when you mention climate change or even just extreme weather due to global warming, nothing on the sort.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the first step is just like, there's an issue right now on the awareness of the topics among reporters, among newsrooms, the structure, and I think something we can just discuss later. The media landscape is not built to cover this crisis at the moment, and it's something we need to change structurally and culturally of how we see ourselves as reporters, and potentially something we can work with scientists all over the world.
Okay, it's really interesting that you say that, because one of the important elements of a toolkit, or some of the things that we're trying to produce as a project, is media training, and I think in some instances that means almost training journalists by proxy to try and increase that understanding and competence. So it's really interesting you've mentioned that already. Okay, Lydia, what's your take?
Very similar to Peter and Diego's. I would say it's a crisis of conversation as much as it is like the physical crises that we see sort of manifest around us. And it's a particular type of conversation that we're not really having, and that's in our communities. Quite often when we talk about climate change, or like we read it, we may be consuming that in quite an individual way, or maybe we're consuming it in an isolated way in our job roles. But the conversations that we're having as a community, and the decision makers, how they're having conversations, where is that? How are we engaging with that together and helping each other process that? And particularly the power of community is the diversity in our experiences and in our expertise. And so, as we're dealing with climate change, there'll be academics that will focus on very specific areas. But in order to understand the full ramifications of that and what's going to be the best action to take, we really need to have these wider community conversations to know how they all link together. So I think it's a little bit of a crisis of community as much as it is a crisis of all these physical impacts and things that we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, in the context of journalism and mainstream media, I've been kind of augmenting the day job by writing, science articles, opinions, the odd editorial for about 10 years or so. And I've found it very, very frustrating at times to do anything nuanced, anything interesting. The adage, if it bleeds, it leads, and the hook for climate change reporting is often, how many people have died, how much infrastructure has been devastated, and maybe there'll be some reporting around the latest COP. There's a big international meeting and some politicians are going to claim that 1.5 is still alive or something, but there's an incredibly small attention span. There's a very, very rapid news cycle, and anything that would try to begin to connect the dots between, yes, there's a climate crisis, but how did we get here? Yes, there's attempts to reduce our impacts, but what might be the drivers that are thwarting some of those efforts? So Peter, someone who actually teaches science communication, what's your take on the potential role of academics who would want to better engage, want to better communicate the complex and entwined nature of the crisis? Because I can imagine many of them would just give up. I mean, it's kind of quite despairing, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and that really was one of the first messages I wanted to give here. Was I do have colleagues, especially colleagues who are in the natural sciences or study the physical science of climate change, who I do think are apt to give up because they see the long and unhappy history of communicating about climate change and continuously running up against these political walls And so they say, I'm done. You know, there's no reward in this. There's no either professionally or in terms of getting anything done in the real world. So I think that's the first thing that we have to break through is we can't give up. And I would encourage academics also to think about communication really in two ways that may seem a little contradictory. And one is the notion that communication is not a moment. It is a process. Can be a longer term relationship. And so if it doesn't work this week, then maybe a little bit of progress can be made and it succeeds with some audience a little ways down the road. Climate change is a complicated topic. The interconnected crises we're talking about is even more complicated. And so it's unrealistic to expect any given audience member to go to their newspaper or blog or TV program or whatever and say, oh, I just got it. So it's a process, but also I want to encourage people to think about the idea of teachable moments, you know, and those of us who are in academia, I think know about those know when those arise in classes and they arise in the public just in the same way. So, you know, right now is probably a teachable moment in the UK in a way that wasn't a couple of weeks ago when all the media energy was going into what was happening on Downing Street and not what the weather was doing. So it's sort of a combination of think about communication as a longer term process. If it doesn't work well today, there's always tomorrow, and be prepared for those times when it seems like there may be a teachable moment when suddenly a good deal of progress can be made in a short time.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, the problems are not going to go away. Let's just say so. There's going to be repeated opportunities for us to try to make these teachable moments. I think this is my good time to ask you about some of your work with the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, Diego, because I think one of the motivations, at least one of the things I see you doing with that network is try to link some of the, or maybe even curate or produce some of those teachable moments by linking them to the kind of the social and political aspects of the kind of the environmental change that we're seeing. So, you know, this heat wave didn't come out of nowhere, right? It's the phenomena of wider social, political, economic kind of forces. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just respond to your question, like by going around some of what Lydia and Peter said. And I think I really like this idea of the crisis conversation that Lydia suggested. I think this is a big taboo around climate change, the topic in our societies right now. And you see this all over the world in the media, especially you see it as when you go, when our athletes, our members, we have 100 members per semester. We have now into our second semester now, it's starting in July. And something we hear a lot is that they ask their members, the reporters ask their audience, what do you want to read? Climate change always goes up here, usually more progressively now, but it's up here. But when you put climate or emissions on the headline, people just don't click. And I think it's part of this crisis conversation that like Lydia mentions. And it's something we need to rethink how we do journalism. It's something we need to rethink, like the whole structures of like our institutions. We are using 20th century institutions to just try to tackle this crisis, and it's not working. And what we do in the network is we try to link people together and with scientists and experts around the world. So we first put experts and scientists and really specialists in front of them to just share some ideas. But I think crucially, we try to create new connections networks among reporters. So we have, I said 100 per term. And the idea is that there's so much you can learn from people next to you, even possibly more than people in front of you, like these speakers or whatever you have in front of you. And I think in this way, one of the things we're trying to do is to restructure the way journalism works around climate change, trying to challenge metrics, challenge practices, newsroom structures, and also try to like open up new ways to understand who is an expert and who isn't an expert on climate change. So an issue we hear a lot from countries that are not the global north is we don't have access to scientists as you have in the UK, the US, France. It's much more challenging to find local experts if you live in, I don't know, I've heard from colleagues in South Africa, from colleagues in Malawi, from colleagues in El Salvador. So then maybe how to rethink expertise. And I think this is maybe not necessarily the topic of your people and the faculty, but it's also how do you create new stories and new ways to communicate? And what Peter mentions, like moments of still moments, that is not necessarily the traditional expertise or traditional way of like just talking science down, but just finding new ways to discuss it and make it approachable, in this case, for reporters and people around the world.
Yeah. Okay. So then, actually, no, I think what we're going to do now, we have a question from the audience. We have a question from the audience. So just to remind our audience members, when you do have a question, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box. I think we try to monitor the chat and we'll pick questions out, but certainly if you put it in the Q&A, then we can get to that directly. So we have a question from Robert. It's a question to you, Lydia. He says, Lydia emphasized community. Could you say a bit more about what that means? What do you mean by community? Which forms of community can help produce conversations that are more or less productive?
How long have we got, James? I mean, it's a great question. Thanks for that, Robert. Well, Maggie Thatcher famously said, like, community's got, like, well, what is that? For me, community is found in different ways. And I think we are all parts of different types of community. And quite often we find that our communities are formed around something that we have in common. That could be values. So maybe it's faith groups, or maybe it's your location. It's your Facebook group with your neighbours, or maybe it's the fact that all your children go to the same school and you're part of the same mums and dads WhatsApp group. There are different types of communities that form around things that we have in common, but even then within them, there is usually a diversity of something. Unless you've got a very specific type of community where you're all kind of exactly the same. Now, when we identify what it is you have in common, that's usually something you care about, or something that that at least links you all. So for faith groups, you have this particular set of values that you have in common. Now, if you show how that interacts with climate, like creation care, is a very common narrative that we would see for religious communities, for example. This helps people engage with their community, with their shared values together. There's individual elements of creation care, but that are also quite clear community-based actions that can pull people together. So you talked about things that are effective. Look at where the communities already are, and not necessarily saying we need to create new communities, but I think there definitely is space for us to be engaging with communities that we're maybe on the fringes of, part of, or introduce climate conversations there in different ways. How is climate impacting, for example, the Tour de France? I have lots of friends who love cycling, so I can talk to them about that in different ways. So speak, like, where is community? I think it's found in different ways. And in my day job, I work a lot with businesses, and it's a big community that we don't often speak to, really, with our communications. We do a lot of public-based communications, engaging with people as citizens, but a lot of us work a 9 to 5 where we're chained to a desk or something similar. How do you engage with the climate and this crisis in your 9 to 5, where you have a real limit on what it is you can do? I think that's a whole community that we haven't really tapped into yet, and it has loads of different types of resources, and it's pulling people together in different ways. And different things that people value there, incentivize people with their pay packets. So there's whole forms of different types of community engagement that we can do with different communities.
That was a great answer.
If I can jump in, James, I think it's interesting what Lydia says, because something we've noticed in our community of reporters is, I think for every field, climate change is weirdly impacting everyone, but everyone feels isolated. Everyone feels alone dealing with the crisis. Just like if you're in a reporting newsroom and you're the only one in your newsroom, you feel extremely alone. And this might happen to scientists all over the world and like to any field. And I think what we found is, like, by having a community of reporters, and having somewhere you can go back to every couple of weeks and just keep talking to people who share your frustrations, dreams, and everything, then you can break this crisis of conversation that Lydia was mentioning at first. You can break the taboo, and then from there build something from there. You can build like energy to just challenge your newsroom, energy to talk to your bosses, talk to your colleagues, and this can apply to any single profession. Because if you are working as a whatever field, you have people who think like you and share your fears and frustrations. Just about finding them, which is arguably tricky. But increasingly, as it gets more and more widespread, the climate crisis, it gets less difficult to find people who are equally frustrated by this.
Yeah, that being isolated or being the lone voice, and it's something that resonates quite strongly with me and some of my academic practice. You would imagine, I mean, given the work that I've done, I would be surrounded by people who also share values, yeah, but often it's not, surprisingly not. And there was a few years ago, I put together an event where there were sustainability practitioners from a whole bunch of different companies, different sectors, and we were all getting together because it was meant to be some kind of student experience event. But the thing I found most interesting is that the people from all these different companies found that event really, really useful, and actually in some instances quite powerful, because they met other people who shared the values. They were alone in their department, sometimes their entire company, because nobody gives a monkeys. Nobody, I mean, it's not outright climate denial anymore, but there's no discussions about, well, what could we do to affect policy? What could we do to go beyond our professional practice? And when they had a whole day just connecting with other people who shared those values and those passions, and also some of their frustrations and fears. So I think when it comes to the building the network of Faculty for a Future, I think in the first instance, one potentially really powerful thing we can do is just to connect academics or pair them up with people who share their values, and then allow them to better understand how they could begin to use their academic practice to affect some kind of meaningful change. Okay, so I've got so many questions to ask you. I've got to get on with it. Right, so we've got, I think we're all on the same page with regards to there's some quite significant dysfunction about the media representation of climate change or the social and environmental crisis. What I would like to know is so I'll come to you first on this, Peter. How do you think academics can actually move the needle on that? How can we make a positive contribution? What kind of things can we be doing, should we be doing, in order to maybe empower journalists, maybe even empower media organizations to better capture, better reflect our current crisis?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think one starting point is really to follow on to the previous question, and to point out that I think it's still commonly a practice that academics can be a little bit placeless, that we're at a university, but maybe our research happens in some other part of the world. And so I certainly think one thing that academics can do to experience some efficacy and some of that all-important feeling of community is to be involved in the local community in some way. Even if maybe their primary research is in the Arctic or somewhere else, but to look for those opportunities for local involvement. And then I think that can translate into helping journalists to find those community-oriented stories that can bring climate change home. There's certainly a place for reporting about all sorts of impacts of climate change around the world, but I think a lot of what people are interested in is what does this mean for me here, in Arizona, in the UK, in wherever. What's the scope of the problem, and what are the scope of potential solutions? So I think that can help to bring climate change down from this enormous global problem, which it is, but to put local faces on it and connect it to local places. So I think the more that academics can do to bring up those aspects of climate change, that's really valuable. And then I guess I would say too that it's also important for scientists to kind of demystify the black box of science. And I think science is often still perceived as a black box. You know, okay, data goes in, and then something happens, and then the scientist publishes something or gives a presentation, and the general audience has no idea what happens in that black box. So I think the more that scientists can do to open up that black box and show, here's what we're doing, here's our assumptions, here's the mistakes that we made. People love reading about mistakes and hearing about mistakes. It's very humanizing. So I think if scientists can open up the process a little bit and get members of the various audiences to realize, oh, they're human beings, they're making decisions, they're making mistakes just like the rest of us, they're doing the best they can. I think that would help a lot.
I mean, that's so interesting, because as a scientist or a natural scientist, in terms of publication and communication, that's often the thing that you should never do. You know, we're taking this view from nowhere. It's just, you know, it's objectivity. It's not so much now, but you're taught to write in the third person. It's never about what you did or it was done or the study has shown. These kind of very divorced facts which kind of pop into being. Of course, when you spend some time in the sausage machine, you know, it's a fascinating and often quite turbulent and very stressful world of hypothesis and testing. And I just can't see why that wouldn't make much more interesting stories. But about stories and compelling stories, here's a good link to another question from our audience. So this comes from Sridhar, who is a research scholar from India. And he asks, all the climate change communication has been criticized as fear-mongering. So this goes back to my, if it bleeds, it leads comment, I guess. How can we change that perception? So I would like, I don't know, Diego, what do you think? Is it just still too easy to frame all climate change comms on the fire and brimstone framing?
It is, and if the result you see from that is disengagement. So something we've been tracking at our institute, is something called news avoidance, which is when people selectively avoid some news because they just don't want to hear about it. Happened with COVID, happens with climate change, happens with war and conflict. And you see news avoidance going on the rise now in several countries, and I can maybe share the link later of our studies. And it's something you see a lot with climate change. And one of the, we don't study climate change news avoidance specifically, we're studying news avoidance, but my theory is that one of the issues is that you don't see enough spaces of empowering climate journalism done. Much of it is just, this is the issue, we're screwed. Which is fair, right? But then it's so much more than that. I mean, there's so much more than that, and there's so many people doing fantastic stuff around the world. And I think a way of going back to this is approach reporters in a way that, or like try to suggest reporters stories that go beyond the doom and gloom. And this might be difficult, but also going back to Peter's question before, it's like, go beyond the environment and science desks with your climate stories, because there's stories about economics and agriculture and media and arts and culture and everything else. And then I think this is very counterintuitive for academics, is don't wait until the peer review is done to pitch a story to a reporter, because the process is a story and the people we have in the process is a story. So there you have like two possible avenues of just telling something that's been done, that's changing something specific, and that shows that there are ways to move the needle forward that is beyond doom and gloom, but that it also involves like people in the community, as Peter said, and people who are doing actual stuff. And then maybe someone who reads about it just sees something interesting. So something I looked some years ago is like, I did some research on media in Latin America, and I was asking myself, how are people portray them? And people are usually portrayed as victims of climate change, never as people like actors with agency who could do something about it. And as long as we keep portraying the citizens as victims instead of like active, people who have agency and actors in climate change, the people will not see themselves citizens as actors who have agency and can change the world.
I'd echo what Diego said about having the different stories. And I think quite often we find if you're only talking about climate change in the context of a very specific, extreme weather event, it's too late. And it just feels like you're wagging the finger saying, oh, it's climate change, told you so, rather than talking about all of the other things, both, other adaptation things that people have been doing to become more resilient to climate change, how it's affecting other parts when it's not just related to a really, let's be honest, traumatic event for people. Fear disengages, hope will engage, but you've got to find the right type of hope to have that much sort of sustained sort of engagement with something, that tangible thing. So it's finding those tangible, sustainable hopes to have hooks in as well.
Yeah, the message. I mean, we used to call them natural disasters, and weather-related natural disaster is something that happens to people. It's a kind of another impersonal kind of process. It's as unfortunate as being in the wrong place at the wrong time when a volcano explodes. So, and treating almost climate change as that kind of natural phenomena, especially the scale of it. Sometimes I mean, look, in terms of fear mongering, oh my goodness. I mean, I look back at some of the things I've written, but what I find fascinating is this sheer scale of the process. We're literally terraforming our home planet. We're literally, changing climate processes and Earth system functions that have been ticking along for millions of years. And so the magnitude of it is just something that seems really important and compelling, but at the same time, that means you risk completely diminishing the role of the individual and taking away all their agency. And then we just become kind of the flotsam and the jetsam. Now, at this point, I mean, following on from what you just talked there, Lydia, what maybe I could just ask you to speak a little bit about some of the research that you've been doing that we've used as the basis for the toolkit, because what we're really motivated to do today and over the following couple of years is try to empower academics to become much more involved in their academic practice, communicating, engaging with, and we've been incredibly inspired by your work. So I wonder if you could just maybe spend a few minutes telling us a little bit about it.
Is now the time for me to share my screen?
It might be.
Let's see if we can get this working. So can you see my screen okay there? Oh, good, thumbs up. So yeah, this was part of sort of like wider mullings for me for some time. As my background is environmental scientist, thinking about how it is I communicate my science, but in a way that's also like true to me. And this sort of eventually, years and years later, led me to doing my PhD. But in a nutshell, what I was finding, and also speaking to my colleagues, is that some academics may feel comfortable doing this sort of thing, going on protests, and some don't. That doesn't mean that you just have to shut up and never say anything, or that this is the only legitimate form of sort of expressing your point of view or making connections with things. The real focus of this toolkit that you'll hear Josephine speak to in a moment as well is to help you make decisions about how it is you communicate, and to do so confidently and clearly in a way that means that you can maintain your integrity and credibility as a scientist. That was really important for me, is that we don't have to keep taking hats off or feel threats to who it is we are. We are both citizens and scientists. So how can we bring all of that we are to our communities, in our conversations, and do justice to all that we are? So when I was sort of looking at this, the key thing that sort of worried scientists, and I was specifically looking to climate change scientists, because the tensions that they were sort of experiencing with their communications with the media, but other sorts of non-expert communication. I use that to mean public engagement or engagement with business or politics. They're really concerned that they must always preserve the trustworthiness and credibility of their science, and policy advocacy, specifically policy advocacy, threaten to undermine that. Now, the caveat is not all public engagement or all forms of communication are forms of advocacy, but you could still sort of feel that advocacy tension if somebody else thinks that you are engaging in bias science, right? Or if somebody else thinks that you are abusing your authority, the status that you have as an academic expert, that you're speaking outside of your expert remit. And these sorts of two things in particular, particularly coming from our own scientific community, right? There's accusations and concern that you would be told that you're creating bias science or you're abusing your position. But actually, this isn't necessarily true. There are absolutely loads of ways in which you can engage in different forms of communication about your work, about these crises, that stay well clear of bias science and abuse of authority. You can actually engage in policy advocacy in ways that are really clear about your motivations and really clear about how that is part of what it is you do. That means you can still maintain the trustworthy and credibility of your science. So this is sort of where I was coming from. For this, I had the absolute privilege, and it was great fun to interview 47 climate scientists about what they think about policy advocacy, what they think about others doing it, the tensions they've experienced in their own communications, how they've overcome them. And from that, I learned so much about these different methodologies that scientists deploy to try and make their communications as clear as they can. But what was also clear is that they all had different moments in different situations and different personal feelings about how it is they wanted to engage with non-experts. So some of them were just really wanted to keep their science clean, such as Neil here. These are different names, obviously. Others felt there was a really strong duty for scientists to communicate, particularly if they were publicly funded, to share that learning with the wider public and to make it accessible to them, not just spitting it out in a journal article, but really helping people to understand the context of it, whilst also then treading the line between the fact that they have expertise in a really specific area, but to describe that wider context, they're going to have to be talking about other areas that are outside of their expertise. Some others just really wanted to make sure that their science was being put to use for useful decisions, making this really valuable. We've got to decide what to do about it. They were quite clear that they're not the decision makers, but please, can we have science-based decision making? And can we have that proper understanding? Appreciate that there's loads of other values and things that you need to take into context and when you're doing this decision making, but let's not make poor scientific literacy a reason for poor decision making. And others were pretty frustrated that this is just something that needs to be solved, right? Let's crack on. And maybe lots of other sort of anger and frustration when they're seeing the coral reefs that they've spent their lifetime studying disappearing, when they're seeing the impact a lot upon the local communities that they've been working with. There was just such a sense of injustice that they really wanted to speak out and advocate for action because it's something that needs to be solved. Now, the concern with all of these sorts of communications is kind of, you could sort of boil it down to, that's not what I said. This is the fear that you say something and it's misconstrued either as biased science, abusing your expertise. Maybe you just had a really bad experience with the media where they've massively misquoted you or they've cut things out. Now, there are different things, and I won't go into too much detail with this, but there are lots of different factors that go into influencing what it is people hear you saying, and that might be quite different to what it is you intend for them to hear. And so I separated these out into like the voice, the content, and the audience, but there's so many different things that play into how people hear what you say. And with these different factors, there are different ways in which you can have more or less control or create better or worse clarity around what you're saying. You might not be able to change the fact that you are, an older white male speaking. That might be quite hard, but you might be able to more clearly articulate and tap into the context and frames for audiences and describe things in a way that would resonate with the audience more and help them understand you more clearly. So the thing that I really like about this toolkit that Faculty for the Future have been putting together are these main things. One, it is not prescriptive. We are not saying that you must go out and become policy advocates or go on the march. This is all about empowering you to think about your communications and what it is you want to be saying, and making that informed decision, and learning how to align those things. It's grounded in research, so bits of mine, but also lots of other people as well. And there's been a real collaborative effort in pulling together these different methods, these tips, and for helping create these clear communications. It champions diversity. We're talking lots about community and bringing in together these shared learnings from across our community and outside of it. Also different types of knowledge, telling different types of story, creativity. And it continues to be informed by academics' experience with these sorts of engagement. This is a living document. We're looking for more and more stories about how people have navigated these things and what has helped them in creating clear communications. It's all about creating clarity in your communications to non-experts. So that's it from me. I'll hand back to you, James.
Many thanks, Lydia. Okay, we've got our next audience question. This comes from Kat Jenkins. So Kat asks, do you think people are more resistant to discussing climate change also because uncomfortable emotions such as shame and guilt can be involved? Our privileged lifestyles in the minority world come at the cost of generational exploitation and trauma. And because as loss and damages become more obviously important, we just don't want to pay. So I'm going to put this towards you, Peter, with the kind of addendum that from a journalist perspective, do you think more emotional approaches or messages from academics that have more emotional content sort of help shift the needle on climate coverage?
I think there's absolutely that potential, yes, because I think that the emotional, an acknowledgement of the emotional toll is something that is often missing. I think both in media coverage in general and in the way that academics talk about climate change, and even in the way that that climate change is talked about in the sorts of community settings that Lydia was talking about a while ago. It's the emotional toll is very clear. You know, there's lots of good research on that these days in climate terms of climate anxiety, and we know a lot about it for certain groups of people, like for undergraduate college students who have been asked about these issues, and there's good information about that. But I think overall there's not nearly enough attention paid to that. And I think that addressing those emotional issues, whether it's a journalist who mindfully does that in their coverage, or an academic who is being interviewed or has an opportunity to give a presentation, I think all those circumstances are opportunities to raise the emotional issue, because I think that can open doors that I think might otherwise be politically closed, or where there's just not the opportunity to communicate between people with different beliefs about climate change. So I think we all need to be doing more of that.
I mean, this is such an interesting discussion because I agree, but it's taken me a long time to agree. And so I want to bring you into the discussion at this point, Diego, because I want to understand from your work and experiences, how can we allow or entice or empower academics to do that? Because I know I've been quite reticent to put any kind of emotional flavoring in some of my work, even the kind of the mainstream media, the kind of the opinions, the editorials, and certainly when I engage with other academics and you're talking to them about these amazing stories and how these stories could produce have an impact because they have such kind of emotional heft. By the time you actually get them into the place where they want to produce and want to write, they instinctively just strip it all out. They don't want to include any of that, and it's incredibly frustrating. So what do you think? I mean, how do we manage that, Diego?
Wow. So I'll think two levels here, and one is more practical, immediate, and goes from, I think, understanding. I think Lydia's mentioned this, understanding the values of reporters as a culture. It just has different priorities than science, the media, you know. We might be covering the same issues in similar ways, but it's just very different how we see the world. And that's fine. And I think that that's starting point to just realize that maybe what you see as reporters doing stuff weirdly, it's just like something we can understand. I think once this like first awareness is reached, then the topic is, yeah, how do you make that connection work? And I think the first thing is, and it's also in journalism, is how do you make yourself vulnerable to others? No, it's an issue that I don't think, because the question is very interesting and just frames this persistence to emotions such as guilt and shame. I think this is more it's a bigger issue. Like, we see guilt and shame as intrinsically negative, whereas if we see them in the face and we just and we just leave them for a second there, engage with the guilt and shame as emotions, just as part of who we are, then it just allows some space for conversation. Okay, why do I feel guilt and shame? Okay, it's because I want to do something else or not. Okay, I wouldn't be feeling guilt or shame if I didn't want to do something else. It's more like something more like us as people, as like Lydia was saying, reporters are also people as well, and we don't deal with our emotions properly either. So I think that's just more like the philosophical level of like emotions and how do you approach them. And I think what more like back to more practical level is, there's so much. My best interviews with scientists are those in which they don't recite the data or their findings, but when they tell me how they felt about something they did, how they experienced the new discovery, what's going through their head, how did they tell to their family. So the more emotional fabric of the science making process is much more interesting for the audiences, and then allows to connect to the people differently and better than just the facts. And this is just goes entirely against what academics are told to do from like undergrad until like PhD or whatever. It's not their language and values, but it's what reporters and I think also audiences require. They require people to connect with, not authorities to look up to, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of reminds me, maybe this is a tenuous analogy, but I'm going to make it anyway. So you've got landmark natural history programs made from the BBC, like Blue Planet, and it's just really, really expensive, really, really impactful. But for me, and I think for many people, often the very best bits of those TV shows are the making of, the little bit they put at the end, where you get to see what the film crew had to do in order to get that 5-second shot of a bird taking flight or a fox catching something, because it gives you a real insight into how they actually did it, and the tremendous efforts and almost kind of the battle of wills, the battle of elements, the very human stories that came to produce that particular bit of natural history. And I think, in terms of natural history, my day job would be pretty boring. It's me sat at a desk. It's not the most exciting kind of story you could tell, but all the emotional content, I think, is absolutely, it should be ripe for us to be able to produce stories about, how people are generating the knowledge, what that knowledge means in the context of a potential crisis. Anyway, look, we need to get on because the next thing I need to do is introduce someone. So I'm going to introduce Josephine, who is going to talk about, so Josephine is a colleague of mine at Faculty for a Future, and she's going to talk about this toolkit that I've been kind of referring to, because I think the ambition of the toolkit is to seriously address some of the challenges, some of the barriers to engagement, more effective communication that we have been talking about. So Josephine, why don't you tell us about the toolkit?
Thank you, James, and thank you also all of the panelists. Fascinating discussion. So much of what has already been discussed, really feeds into the set of the approaches that I'm about to introduce to you. But before I do that, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself and how I came to Faculty for a Future. So previously, until 6 months ago or so, I was a journalist myself. I worked for a website called The Conversation, which I'm sure lots of you will be aware of. So it's a news and analysis site in which academics write journalistic articles. So I spent 8 years commissioning and editing academics to write more journalistic pieces. So a lot of what that involved was kind of encouraging them to open up and be more emotional and talk about the day-to-day aspects of what their role involved in order to really, pique the audience's interest. So in my 8 years, I kind of got less and less specialized as I went on. So I started as arts editor, and then during that time did a master's in science and technology studies. And the process of doing that and kind of studying the interaction of science with society really led me to feel that traditional kind of journalistic desks, maybe in a similar way to academic disciplines, were quite restrictive in the way that we cover some of these issues. So then off the back of that, I basically lobbied for the creation of a cross-desk position and became interdisciplinary editor in 2017, and then kind of started moving towards commissioning big picture kind of think pieces, long form pieces, which really gave academics the space to go into their journey and how they went about creating a particular body of research, and how that research kind of fit into the bigger picture in the wider world. So that kind of led me to Faculty for Future, along with editing a piece about net zero that was written by James and Wolfgang, another Faculty for Future member. And at Faculty, I'm Director of Communications, and amongst other things, what that means is I'm managing this engagement project and this toolkit. So for the past few months, basically since I joined, we've basically been discussing everything that we've been talking about today. So the fact that, yes, there are really good reasons why academics might feel hesitant about linking social and environmental crises and issues. But given where we're at and what's going on, and the trust as well that the public places in academics experts, that we really have to find ways for them to tell this bigger story. So myself, my colleagues at Faculty for Future, Lydia and Laurie Label-Langton from IPPR, have basically been working on creating this toolkit. It's a 10-page toolkit containing 5 approaches, derives, as you've heard, kind of really leans heavily on Lydia's research into climate scientists. It leans heavily on that, but it's very much envisaged as a toolkit that will be of use to all academics in whatever discipline, and also draws on kind of all sorts of other environmental communications literature. Where we're at now is basically it's been reviewed by a small group of communications experts, academics, journalists, and feedback has been really positive. We're basically now working towards publishing a beta version of this toolkit in a few weeks, that we then hope to co-develop with your help and the help of our wider community, to work up something which is as useful as possible for academics, and that will be published at the beginning of next year. So what I'm just going to do is whiz through the actual toolkit and the 5 approaches very quickly. 1 minute, share my screen. Yeah, so my aim is, not to go into enormous amounts of detail, but really just give you a sense of the scope and direction of what we're trying to do here, in the hope that you might want to kind of get involved in helping us shape and develop it further. And I'll talk a little bit about what we plan with that towards the end. So in brief, the toolkit contains 5 approaches. It's important to me to say that, these are, as Lydia said as well, these aren't really configured as prescriptive at all or one size fits all. They're intended as more of a pick and mix. So some academics will feel comfortable using some of these techniques and not others. Totally fine. Some, they suit different types of public engagement. Some are maybe more suitable to an interview with a journalist, and others, a talk with a local community group, for example. Some will be more suitable for friendly contexts, and others more adversarial situations. And yeah, they're not prescriptive. And relevant to all academics, perhaps initially most relevant to natural scientists, because they, for obvious reasons, currently have the biggest platform, but it's our hope, along with the work of this toolkit, that more different types of experts will be given more of a platform. So first up, share the real world motivations that led you into academia in the first place. So this really touches on some of the stuff that we've been talking about around emotions. So I'm just going to apologize in case you can hear all of that rummaging upstairs. That sounds a bit like someone's moving house. Hope you can't hear that. Yeah, so what we were talking about earlier in terms of the emotions and the real reasons why academics do what they do, what led you into your area of expertise. So for example, last week we launched our research hub, and we had an event similar to this, and one of the panelists there spoke about the deep wonder and curiosity and kind of the values and even love that drove her to research what she did, and how rare actually it is that is on display when academics do public engagement. So what this approach in the toolkit is all about is encouraging academics to be open about these motivations. So as Lydia's explored, academics are sometimes worried about discussing motivations and values, and there's good reason for this. But we're not talking about discussing politics here or specific policy advocacy necessarily. We're instead talking about something much broader. So being open about the kinds of fundamental widespread feelings and values that do in fact motivate research. So an academic might speak in defense of the scientific method, for example, or science-based decision-making, or perhaps the wonder they hold at the incredible diversity of life on this planet and why that led them to study what they do, or the importance they hold in advancing gender equality. So what this approach is really about is asking yourself, what are the fundamental things you value that led you to do what you do? And what were the moments or experiences that led you to hold these values? And what our toolkit explores is how speaking about these values or motivations kind of can naturally lead you on to discuss the complex dynamics that are putting those things at risk. Next, so being open about the limitations of your area of expertise. So this approach is about reminding academics, your expertise is crucial, but it's only one part of a much bigger puzzle. And of course, most issues or questions that you're likely to be asked in an interview or in whatever kind of public engagement that you're doing actually require input from many different types of experts. So when you consider this, perhaps actually the easiest way to signal what we've been talking about today, so that connection between or the entanglement of social and environmental crises, is to be honest about the limitations of one's own discipline. And talk about them in relation to whatever topic is being discussed. And in cases, maybe this would extend to the limitations of academic knowledge itself. So next, thirdly, platform others. So this approach is kind of a natural follow-up to the previous one. It's about going one step further than highlighting the limitations of your own discipline and discussing other work that it intersects with. Academics interact with colleagues from other disciplines and countries in a way that other members of society just don't. More than this, they actually have a duty to be aware of how their expertise fits into the bigger picture and why it's relevant, why it's important. Many already regularly train themselves and talk about other subjects and areas that are related to, but beyond their specialism when they teach. Public engagement can kind of be viewed similarly. So we ask basically, why shouldn't the same norms apply? This approach is about encouraging academics to pass the baton on to other expert voices, including those that are currently missing from the debate. So there are a few ways that this could be done. One, referencing conversations that one might have had with experts in other disciplines or perhaps colleagues across the world, talking about consensus findings in other areas of research that perhaps you've had to read up on as part of your job anyway, or just straight up suggesting to the journalist or producer or editor, whoever you're talking to, that others that are actually relevant to the discussion are given a voice and that they're invited to talk next time. So next, make connections. Talk about how your work interacts with the wider world. Lots of research shows that by connecting with an audience, by opening up emotionally or sharing an important or personal experience, so again, this really touches on what we've been discussing, means a speaker will come across as more credible and legitimate. This is really often what journalists are after. it's about basically relating to your audience as a human being, perhaps rather than as an academic or an expert. This approach is about saying to academics, so yeah, you're clearly passionate about your work and deeply care about it, but others might not see this or understand why it's important, or the wider world it relates to. So talk about this, what is it actually like in the context of colliding social and environmental crises? This might be, talk about the frustrations of your role, or research you did was ignored or not kind of acted on. What values or interests or skills might others share with you? So last but not least, use real world examples of resilience to bring the complexity of crises to life. And in this, we actually do exactly what Diego, you were talking about earlier. So talk about, how this is actually happening across the world, but do so in a way that engenders hope. Stories are relatable in a way that the latest findings in climate science just aren't. And they have a unique power in building understanding of complex issues because of that relatability. So this final approach in our toolkit is about using stories to tell a relatable and real story about how these crises intersect. They don't need to be speculative. In this approach, we advise academics to discuss real life recent examples of how social and environmental crises are manifesting and mixing in the real world. And crucially do so in ways that empower people rather than disengage them. So we draw on the latest research in how to actually do that. So what that looks like is, for example, by telling a particular story of crisis in which human decisions and individual actions built resilience, enabled future flourishing, and giving hope through that specific example. And then maybe zooming out to the bigger picture and saying, actually, this isn't representative of the whole, and encouraging the conditions in which such decisions and actions can be made is really what we need to be doing. So yeah, that's a very, very swift run through our toolkit. A quick, actually, well, I forgot to mention in that last one is what we also hope to do is feature in this eventual toolkit specific examples of such stories that academics can draw on when they're doing public engagement work. So the final version, as I said, we aim to publish early next year, and throughout the toolkit, what we want is that for there to be a few kind of case studies or examples of each of these approaches in action, and for these to be relevant to kind of academics in different context disciplines or different types of public engagement. And what we want to do over the next few months is work with our community to gather these and kind of workshop them. And it will also be supported by what we're calling a kind of living library. So a never-ending expansion of academics using these approaches and giving examples of how they can actually work. So yeah, we're publishing a beta version towards the end of the summer, and then we want to start kind of much more extensive review testing process with potential users. So we want to workshop each of these approaches with academics and use them to gather examples, but also stress test them. And if you want to take part in any of these stages, we'd really love to hear from you and let us know through our website. So we've got about 20 minutes left, so it'd be great to hear a bit about what people feel about this and what their gut feel is to our approach and what we're doing, how this might be made more useful.
I thought that was really exciting. I loved the parts where there was an invitation to academic speakers to talk about their values, what drew them to the work, and the emotional reaction that they have to the work, the findings they're generating. At the end of the day, no one can argue with your personal emotional response. That's yours. That's always right. So no one can criticize or can criticize that. And also, I was so struck by the parallel in journalism. We also, many climate correspondents feel like we have to walk that line between not being perceived as activists when we're actually journalists. Particularly in newsrooms, the majority of whom haven't really understood necessarily the gravity of the situation or engaged in the way that we have. So we're all in the same boat in a sense. And many of the journalists that you'll be speaking to will be navigating similar dilemmas. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for us to collaborate and really come together at a deeper level. So thank you for this work. I think it's really important.
Okay, many thanks, Matthew. And Sagar, we don't have much time left, I'm afraid, but I'd be very interested in your initial brief kind of responses and thoughts. Also some advice, if you have it at this point, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting idea, but what we really need to do is to actually implement it somewhere and show that it is working. And that is when I think people will buy into it. Let me give you a problem that we have been finding not very easy to communicate. It's related to climate change as well as to people. There is an activity going on in some parts of the world, particularly the developing world, called the People's Assembly. And what they're trying to do is to actually say that the people's voices are not really reaching the policymakers. It's the scientists and the journalists and policymakers who go to the COP meetings or what have you, and so on and so forth. So people's assemblies of small groups of people are being held in different parts of the developing world. And some of my researchers have been involved with this and came out with some very startling stories, which otherwise probably wouldn't have become visible to us. And we've not been able to get this out into the media. Now, in their work in a place which is about 100 kilometers from Hyderabad, they were talking to farmers. And in the process of talking to farmers, they found that some farmers have committed suicide because of the vagaries of weather. Now, what farmers normally do is they take loans, and if their crop fails repeatedly, then they go into debt. And if they're unable to pay back the debt somehow or the other, a fraction of them, a very small fraction, of course, they commit suicide. Now, it may sound like a very small fraction, but if you look at India as a whole, the figures are pretty startling, because in the last 20 odd years, more than about 400,000 farmers are recorded to have committed suicide because of indebtedness. Now, the minute a farmer's family becomes indebted, what happens is that the moneylender, normally they have access to money lenders, and it's not so easy to get bank loans, really. So farmers go to money lenders, private money lenders. The money lender approaches the family for the return of the money. Leave the interest aside. He says, okay, give me the principal. And when the family says, listen, we can't do it, then the money lender says, all right. He tells the wife, then why don't you come home? And you know the implication of that. And he says, if you can't come, send your teenage daughter. Now, this is something that, you know, we discovered by just talking to farmers in these people's assemblies. We've not been able to put this out into the press as yet, you know, in India. So these are issues which, for example, I don't know if the toolkit can really handle something of this sort, but we've been struggling to put out something of this sort with adequate, you know, proof that this is how it happened and this is what happened. Now, I wonder if the toolkit can handle these kind of issues in developing countries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, what do you think of that, Josephine?
Thanks, Javier. That's fascinating, and this is exactly the kind of stories that we're hoping to platform using the fifth approach in the toolkit. So what are these real local stories that can give meaning to this complexity of these crises, and hopefully kind of help us find a way through it that aren't currently being told, and how can academics use their platforms in order to tell those stories. So yeah, it'd be great to reach out to you and discuss maybe how we can think about featuring some of those stories in the toolkit itself, if that sounds good to you.
Now, this might appear a bit of a sort of a meta question, Lydia, because a lot of the toolbox was actually based on your research. So
I've got to like it. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, thanks very much. And needless to say, we're all very impressed by what, your work and the direction in which we're taking the toolkit to go. But at this point, what do you think the most important next steps for us are, and that our wider community, people who might want to get involved with Faculty for a Future?
Oh, most important next steps. I mean, the thing about this toolkit is that it's got to be useful. As Sagar was saying, is bring to light the problems that we've got, things that are particularly tricky to communicate. Actually, Sagar, that's an issue that I work on in my day job. We look at providing different types of parametric insurance, which can sort of get around sort of those money lender problems. So that's a form of adaptation and resilience building for Indian farmers when you provide them with different types of financial products. So again, it's this resilience narrative. That's the one that I think is really quite exciting to explore in this toolkit, and one that my research didn't really touch on much. And I think it's a particular frame that I think simultaneously provides us with a categorization of the problem in its truest form. It really lets us speak to the concerning issues and also the hope for true resilience. Now, just a quick thing on that word resilience. Sometimes it has been used as a word to sort of oppress different communities and say, you've just got to bounce back to how things were. We're really defining it here as adaptation actions and mitigation actions that really help facilitate the flourishing of that community. Not just that they bounce back to where they were, but how do we help people improve and be even better? So it's those sorts of things that we're looking to communicate here. So how can we help people engage with the seriousness and the full extent of the risks of the crisis and manage those risks so successfully that they result in great resilience? These stories are what we need. We need this real world hope, and we need to be able to communicate those well. So I think in terms of, what's next for this toolkit, getting these true stories in, really thinking about the resilience is really putting these things into practical action. And it goes full circle to what we were talking earlier about systems change versus sort of incremental change. The way in which we all sort of adapt and build resilience to these and the actions that we have. There will be some actions that are good for big chunks of society, and there'll be actions that really need to be tailored to each individual's circumstance. So those small incremental changes maybe. These sorts of communications will help bring all of those to light.
Many thanks. Okay, and then I think we're going to leave the final word to you, Matthew. So and I suppose it's well, my question to you would be that the reason we're here today is because we're concerned about the crisis. There might be, I think Lydia's just given a really interesting and potentially very powerful and positive framing around resilience and what we can do, not just to survive and hold on by our fingernails, but to make things better, that flourishing future for humanity that we would like to maybe sometimes think wistfully about. But given that probably we are quite concerned and we are beginning to unpack the box of the complex crisis that Sagar began to do so effectively at the start of our event today, what would your, not even necessarily advice, what are your comments to the academics here today? What can they do to better engage with communities, with media? Any parting pearls of wisdom?
Yeah, take risks. Just go a little further over the edge and see what happens, and you may be surprised. I'd love to do another session. I feel like I could have told you more about what happens inside the sausage factory, which I've spent my whole career in and out of. Maybe that's the next stage of this work, where I can kind of lift some veils on how we think, our thought processes, our biases, our prejudices, our vulnerabilities, and our virtues at times, very occasionally. And maybe that will help to kind of dissolve some of the barriers that might still stand in the way of that richer engagement that you're obviously calling in. So really hoping that we can build on what we've discussed today and see what comes next.
Hi to those of you that don't know me. I'm Jordan. I sit right at the centre of Faculty for a Future, connecting all of our different projects. I used to be an academic. I escaped after the trauma of my PhD, and I don't use that word lightly. And I actually met Josephine at the conversation. That's a part of the big motivation for my passion for this project, is seeing so many natural scientists and social scientists really concerned about where we're heading, but not really knowing how they can engage credibly. I just want to say a couple of words about the toolkit itself, just a couple of caveats. So first of all, it was written largely from a global north perspective, and that's partly because that's where Faculty for a Future was founded, and it's also because the global north is the epicenter of the human systems that are underlying our environmental crises. And so for now, I would say that, you know, we can feel confident that these strategies will be useful in global north media contexts. We know that in many countries in the global south, actually, the media context is very, very different. And that's something that we're looking into developing support for. But that said, I just want to emphasize that one of the main things that we're really looking to achieve with this toolkit and what follows is to open more space for voices beyond the natural sciences. And that's not to say that you know, we don't want natural scientists in the conversation. It's quite the contrary. But actually, a big motivation for this toolkit is that we know that natural scientists are feeling a lot of pressure to carry the entire weight of the crisis alone. You know, that I think we're probably all in agreement here on the call that there are deep economic and political roots to this crisis. It's not just a technical crisis of energy transition and emissions reduction, but it's natural scientists that are getting the platform. And so a lot of these strategies are designed at saying, well, if you're a natural scientist, how can you speak about the limitations to your expertise and the other factors that are involved in a way that doesn't force you to rely on being the quote unquote expert in an area that you don't necessarily feel expert in. So I just want to give a special shout out to the natural scientists, say, please, you know, get on board and help us open the space, that it doesn't have to be just you. And then there can be more space for social scientists, academics in all disciplines to use the toolkit in the ways that feel right for them. And the final thing really is that we want to open the space for new voices, full stop, right? So perhaps the central motivation for all of this is to identify and support a new generation of academic communicators who really want to lean into the complexities of talking about complexity and find a way of moving the needle credibly and without abusing authority. And so it's for that reason that we don't want the journey to end with the toolkit itself. We are designing alongside the toolkit some media training to help you, first of all, contextualize the strategies in real world contexts, give you some other helpful tips and tricks for media settings, and then also give you practice, give you the opportunity to connect with other academics that are wanting to lean into this challenge. You practice with each other with facilitation from a media training with loads of expertise, friendly interviews, and even more hostile ones if that's what takes your interest. And we hope that will be launching in the end of September. So please look out for that, and we would love to see you there. At the same time, we're also establishing partnerships with strategic communications networks who have connections to media, to journalists, to broadcast, to print. And we hope to be able to place some of you in media opportunities as they arise. And accompanied with that, we are pretty confident that we're going to be able to provide a smaller number of people more in-depth media training. So that's hopefully given you a picture of the broader package beyond the toolkit itself. And I'd love to get the panelists' thoughts, and I want to maybe take the initiative here and just ask for panelists' reflections on a particular aspect of the toolkit that I find that resonates with me and I feel really passionate about. You know, I've spoken before about that I hope we're not alone in seeing the inaction on the crises that we face as having deep political and economic roots. And I guess the thing that fascinates me, and that was really communicated in the Net Zero article that we put out there, is that academics have more experience than most of seeing good research being ignored because of political reasons, for example, right? They're right at the center of the nexus between science and society. So, you know, we've been talking about reflecting more on emotions and experience. I guess it would be good to ask, particularly Peter and Diego, you know, do you think that there is a safe road in here for academics to talk about their professional experience of the ongoing failure of the science society contract?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. That's not a question I can answer for any given academic, right? And there's a lot of work to be done here that is kind of within the academy, and I'm talking about things like our academics recognized professionally for community engagement work that they do, even if it doesn't result in a conventional publication or the sorts of professional milestones that academics are traditionally rewarded for. So I think there's a whole nother sphere of work that needs to be done at the academic level. I'm seeing some good signs that some of that is happening, but that's probably a little bit separate from what we're talking about here. I mean, I think what strikes me is that the sort of engagement work that we're really asking academics to do, I think just has it has several synergistic benefits, because I think it can help break down the just the despair some of us can feel from seeing the way things are going. There's lots of good evidence out there that connecting with others is the critical thing that we need to do to be able to address climate change, whether in a utilitarian way or even in an emotional way. So I think if we do that, there are personal benefits, and then there are the community benefits and communication benefits. So, I don't really see a barrier there that we shouldn't go in that direction. But of course, for every individual academic, it'll be up to them to decide how far down that road they want to go.
And yeah, sorry, did you want to get some immediate reflections from Diego as well, Jordan?
I would love that. Yes, please.
Thanks. No, I think I'll just I'll just circle back to, I think Lydia's point of earlier on of not every scientist will feel comfortable doing all of this. And I think that's why I like it's not prescriptive, the toolkit. It's just very these are some of my tips and ideas. When I work at the ministry in Costa Rica, some people of our staff were not really comfortable talking to the media in some ways. Some were better talking to the public, and some were just better doing desk office at the ministry. And something we had to learn as communication staff, and I think it's something that connects a lot with what I see here, is everyone will find their own way. And I think Peter mentioned this, every guy will find their own way. But what I think crucially is your journey, whatever you set to tell, whatever it is extremely relevant for telling the story of the climate science. And the fact that you are less or more involved with anything outwardly or communication is okay, but that story in itself is fantastically relevant. One of my favorite science journalism stories ever is a story about the Higgs boson, and it was about one of the lead scientists who had to fly back from LA back to Geneva, and it started with how she was missing her daughter's birthday. And it's something you don't see in usual science storytelling, but it allowed me to connect with this woman who was missing this birthday, and just made her very real, and her struggle very real, and why she was there. That's
lovely. So can I ask you, Lydia? This might be, I don't know if it's strange to see this, maybe not your baby, maybe the conception. I don't know. Let's not belabor that metaphor, or sorry. What? How do you?
I'm pregnant as well, James. So you got it spot on.
Well, oh, congratulations! I was about to say pregnant with possibilities. Yeah. What? How do you see these ideas evolving, and what do you think? I mean, given your experience thus far, as well as, there's a lot of optimism and excitement around what we're trying to do, but where do you see maybe some of the potential barriers, or maybe even roadblocks popping up?
Yeah, good question. The thing that really excited me about this research, and then seeing, it's an absolute privilege to then see your research then going to something that's actually useful, that people are actually going to read, not just a PhD thesis sat on a shelf, is that it's useful for people's own experiences, and that it just doesn't stop, and that we constantly learn from that. It's really important that it's practical in that way for me. And I think some of the the barriers that we might face is in trying to learn those practical stories. And also, you know, there is already so much good communication going on, and we've had some examples discussed here already, and I know there's other projects going on to categorize the sort of to gather. We talked about the living library, the Faculty for a Future hoping to gather. The barriers that we might experience might be more like internally and of ourselves. I was reflecting on the question about engaging like the emotions of the scientists. For me, when I was doing my environmental science research, I would have to quite frequently shut off my emotions in order to just get through the day, and I still get that now. When I'm writing designing communications for Madagascan farmers about how completely horrific the future's looking for them, you have to shut emotion off in a particular way. So actually there's something for the academic community here to learn about how it is we tap into those emotions that we can maybe so often shut down in order to get the job done. It's not just as easy as asking us, tell us your emotions. And we need help thinking those through and in a safe and sort of nurturing way as well. But there are other barriers, like we can, we might just see public engagement as a PowerPoint presentation. That ain't it. It's the communications down the shop. It's the other things that we engage with. So really just one of the great ways in overcoming those barriers is to look at your communications not as something that you do at people, but something you do with people. And I've noticed some of the comments in the chats and questions have also talked about collaboration with not only just other disciplines, absolutely lots to learn from environmental humanities and other people in psychology. That informed a lot of my research, and I learned a lot from that community. Storytellers, creative people, musicians, artists, people who work with children. There's so much to learn from other types of communicators that I think, and if we just stick within this academic community with people giving feedback on graphs, graphs don't really engage the vast majority of people. Let's work with other creative communicators. So yeah, I think collaboration is a great way of overcoming the potential barriers that we might experience.
Okay, yeah. Diego, was that a hand?
Yeah. I think it's just something I want to like add to this, which is that I feel that the place to start for this is friends and family, because our friends and family don't talk about climate change often. We had a survey in Costa Rica, and it was like 70% of people care about climate change, but only like a third talk about climate change with their family and friends. And this is the place to begin. I mean, train and practice with your family and friends, and then from there take it to the next level. But it's usually the first circle of like connections that will help us like break the barriers and the taboo and the spiral of sounds.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another audience question coming in, which I'll probably ask Jordan this question. But before I do that, and I think we do have time, is I want to ask you, Peter, about sometimes academics. Okay, we're the generators of knowledge, therefore we're kind of important, but also I think many academics don't really appreciate that they do have quite a privileged position in society in terms of the trust, in terms of journalistic sources, but also in wider society. I think, academics are listened to and they're trusted, right? So, I mean, is that actually important when it comes to telling the story of the crisis right now, this particular privileged position that academics have?
Yeah, I absolutely think it is. And I think that is buttressed when we engage in good practices, like the toolkit's important recommendation about acknowledge limitations. I have to acknowledge I'm a scholar of communication. I'm not a climate modeler. That's not my thing. But I think, as in other realms where privilege is being discussed, that it becomes incumbent on us to acknowledge that privilege, but then also to try to expand it. And I think a great practice for an academic to have when there's an opportunity to talk to a journalist or talk to a community organization or the local council or whatever, is to really mindfully pass the mic over to someone else, and maybe that's in my part of the world, there are wonderful grassroots organizations that are centered in indigenous communities, many of which really are on the front lines of desertification and water shortages and so on. And there's great work coming out of those organizations, but those organizations don't have that same privilege of ready connection to the media or to decision makers. So I think we as academics can do a lot to sort of have a short list, not only of maybe my colleagues who I want to pass a journalist along to, but those outside academia who have a lot to say.
Yeah, that's a great link to our audience question, as it happens. So well done. So we got this question here from Adrienne Gali, and they asked, does the toolkit speak to, or are you interested in actively connecting to scholars and work in the environmental humanities? Many work at the intersection of environmental crisis, global cultures, history, storytelling, narratives, and affect emotion. And I'm going to ask Jordan that, because I think it is the case that we still tend to prioritize physical climate scientists when we do reporting about the climate crisis. So how do you want to respond to that, Jordan?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to pick up on what Diego said. You know, I'm proof that speaking to friends and family work, because after quite a few tense conversations with my parents, my mum has changed the way she votes for the first time. In the most recent election. So conversation matters. And likewise, picking up on what Peter said, the final strategy in the toolkit is really about passing the mic to those outside academia through the lens of telling real world examples of what's actually going on in the present. So even, there's a form of passing the mic, which is using your voice to elevate the voice of others. And we'd really like to emphasize that as a potential way that academics can contribute here. Talking directly to this question, absolutely, yeah, we're so interested in connecting the work of those in environmental humanities and all disciplines, really. We speak. What I said about natural scientists is just by virtue of the sheer fact that actually it's natural scientists that get most of the airtime, because that's where a lot of the journalists are out there seeing this issue through this quite narrow lens that goes, oh, it's a technical issue. Well, we'll get somebody who's a natural scientist on to talk about it. And so, for the natural scientists, it's a case of how can you use your platform to pass the mic on to those outside academia, but also those inside academia who are not getting the same platform. The strategies themselves are relevant to everybody, I think, not just natural scientists, because it's about what's personal to you. What's your motivation? What is the limitation of your expertise? What stories can you tell from your experience of your work, from your experience of interacting with the decision makers in society, which academics do a lot. So yes, absolutely. I think we're facing the unavoidable fact that the opportunities are fewer and farther between for those who aren't in the natural sciences. But one of the things that we want to do when we're linking up with these strategic communications networks is to try and identify key routes in to the media context and to bring new voices into that context who don't necessarily come from a natural science background. So if that sounds like you, then please, we would absolutely love you to get involved. And it might even be, nice to hear whether Peter or Diego have any ideas about, what are routes in for those outside of natural sciences to talk about these intersecting environmental and social crises that we face.
Yeah, it's I mean, just this morning I was contacted by a journalist who wanted me to comment on, I think it was some high profile Twitter thread that's just rehashing a whole bunch of the old climate skeptic denier talking points. Hasn't got warmer, they predicted an ice age. And what they wanted was a physical climate scientist to be able to factually rebut. That's not the story. The story is, why are people continuing to make these absurd arguments? Where's the funding coming from? What ideology supports this kind of radical denialism of science? And so that, I mean, I think we're still some way from doing that, but we've got to start somewhere. So look, we are running out of time. So I wanted to go to Diego, Peter, and Lydia in turn, if I may, and just give you two kind of closing questions. bearing in mind that we've got about 2 minutes left, but don't worry, we can overrun. We're not going to get kicked out, I think. So I don't want to cut off any interesting discussions. So my last questions I'd like to put to you, all is, what do you think are the next steps that we can take to make this as helpful as possible, given your own perspectives and experience? And also, what would be your message to academics maybe joining us today, maybe you're going to be watching this online, the recording later? How can we encourage them to step into this space of communicating some of the complexity, some of the richness, which might mean stepping outside of maybe some of their previous comfort zones? So if I could put those questions to you first, Diego.
Right. The first one, I think the challenge is taking something that is, in the same way, taking something that is written for scientists and for academics in a way that academics talk knowledge, like you have like the facts and the research and everything else, and then just apply the same principles, maybe break it down and bring it to community groups and bring it to the theater, and just see if you can bring more of the humanities approach to storytelling into the toolkit. Just make it very, as living as it could be, which is something maybe planned, but is my idea. And then how to make academics more comfortable, I think it's just like workshopping it, just like trial by error, and making for secure spaces where it's safer to just fail if it's or be uncomfortable, and then slowly trial it and make it easier down the line.
Okay, thank you. And Peter.
Yeah, I think a lot of it can come back to just the virtues of networking, and how within a university, whether within a university or beyond the university, we can really mindfully make efforts to connect with one another. I know at my university that I think there's been some great efforts to connect the social scientists to the physical scientists, to do joint presentations. Maybe it's a matter of, if you're somebody who does climate models or something about the physical nature of climate change, just make contact with somebody who does social science and ask them to come and give a guest lecture in a class to talk about their expertise, because all those small openings of doors can lead to greater comfort with one another and better communication ultimately.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Lydia, what do you think we can do to make this work, and how can we entice more academics to get involved?
Make it work. Well, we know it's kind of already working because some people are already doing great jobs at it. So it's just about learning from them and spreading that learning and finding what's for you and what's not. I think that's also then to the second question: how can you help academics doing that? This toolkit is pretty clear in not asking anybody to step out into the complete unknown. It's actually lots of little tips and tricks for really solid foundational next steps that you can talk about areas that are outside of your expertise authoritatively and effectively by just knowing what the consensus in that area says. Not just the working group 1 IPCC reports. There's the other working groups that provide great summaries on the political context and other things as well. So educate yourself when you're speaking out to be able to authoritatively and effectively quote those other areas of academia and other expertise, tell those stories. So in terms of making it a success, like these are safe steps that you can take, but you choose to take them. Nobody's forcing you in your communications, but there is a way in which you can engage in a way that is suitable for you and manages the concerns and tensions that you think you might experience. There are ways around it. And let's learn from each other about how we manage those.
Thanks so much for coming. Please, one thing that you have to do, if you haven't already, please do visit our website, facultyforafuture.org. If you haven't already, sign up, join our mailing list, learn how you can get more involved, learn how you can begin to use our toolkit and some of the other wonderful things that we're going to be doing over the following months